Our comment today will be given by Sarah Fishman from the University of Houston. As we all know and love her work, of course, it is on Vichy France. And she wrote specifically The Battle for Children, World War II, Youth Crime, and Juvenile Justice in 20th Century France, and a wonderful new textbook on modern France and its empire since 1870, which she co-authored with Alice Conklin and Robert Zaretsky.
Thank you. Can you hear? Is the mic's working okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for these wonderful papers. I know that you guys are going to have questions, so I promise I'm going to keep this short. When I got the slides from Robin, I did send him a note saying, I have to think, is your house wallpapered in this stuff? He wrote back saying, you wouldn't be surprised, would you? He uses crime au marché noir, which he fortuitously discovered, to sketch out the contours of popular crime fiction during the occupation. And no, not surprising, he found that it was filled with anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish criminals behind the scenes, even making the suggestion, which to me is just astonishing, that Jews who lost their property and their jobs and were kicked out of schools and so on somehow managed behind the scenes to retain control with all these front men and were actually operating the full black market, profiting from it. That whole sort of paranoia is just remarkable. What I wouldn't have expected is that he found this kind of crime fiction with such blatant pro-Vichy, anti-Semitic sort of theme underneath that was fairly rare during the occupation. You described crime au marché noir as marginal. But you also argue that the similarly anti-Semitic and xenophobic tropes linking criminality with foreigners, Jews, and degenerates could already be found in 1930s crime fiction. So I'm kind of a little puzzled about how common it was in the 30s. Was it more common in the 30s and in the 40s, or was it rare in both? I'm just a little puzzled about how that continuity going that way works. But in any case, crime fiction, like so many patterns common to this era, follows that pattern of showing this link of the sort of negative aspects of Vichy with what came before, the xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, the anti-Semitism, linking it back to the Third Republic, as happens with so many other elements of Vichy, but also looking forward, where Vichy gives rise to a lot of sort of continuities with the post-war in the more modern, looking more modern. So as, I don't remember which historian wrote this, but Vichy served as the unintentional midwife to changes that modernized France. And here Walls points to the trend, which he kind of skipped over, about literary criticism about crime fiction and new kinds of crime fiction. So that those are trends that we tend to associate with the post-war, but that actually originated during Vichy. And I thought the literary criticism about taking crime fiction seriously and sort of trying to draw the fiction away from being just puzzlers, whodunits, to being serious psychological thrillers with emphasis on literary quality and atmospherics was kind of interesting. Also noting the emergence of the policier noir and polar, hard-boiled crime fiction, highlighting the selfishness and corruption, hypocrisy, which again we sort of associate with the post-war, but you discover it starting during the war. And of course there's an obvious link to Aimé here, and I wonder if it's easier to take that portrayal of corruption and selfishness after the war in crime fiction because it wasn't read as a political critique or satire, but it was seen as an imaginary upside-down world. The one thing I would have liked a little more of, and maybe you can talk about this, is some discussion of readership and audience. What do we know about who was reading this stuff, and if that changed, if you can generalize it all about the background of the people reading this stuff. Okay. Scott Haney in The Drama of Daily Life and Simone de Beauvoir's writings on café underscores just how much Beauvoir wrote about and in cafés. And it gives us this wonderful sense of the texture of daily life in these moments during this very tumultuous and dramatic and traumatic period, both for France and for Beauvoir. It seems to me that a lot of what she experienced and wrote about by her choice in cafes, although I'm not sure I would consider the cafes she hung out in particularly popular as cafes, sort of toys with the idea that maybe, as with existentialism, in fact, Beauvoir came up with the notion of the group infusion, although you sort of throw that out in the end. This is a concept that Sartre uses people in a cafe to illustrate. I also might point out, I wonder if he got some of that from being in a POW camp, which is, again, is a group sort of thrown together that fuses in ways. But ideas about how individuals in a social space merge into a temporary collectivity. In the end, I think you decide that as rich as they weren't Sartre's source, but they do reveal the impact of the cafe as a place that shaped her thoughts. that she may have developed in part her sense of social solidarity, become more engaged in social life via the cafe. What's interesting to me is how much she's just drawn. She simply could not stand to write or to be at home. She needed to be in a cafe to write, something that probably many of us have experienced. And then particularly as France was going through these traumatic moments, she needed to be with other people, to confirm who she was, to see how her responses compared with those of other people, to gain a sense that there was a shared fate. And so I wonder if, again, we're talking about the war as a factor, if that was the thing that sort of pushed her, was this sort of wanting to go through this with other people. Was there something about the war that changed it for her? Okay. So that's what I have to say about Scott Haney. And then finally, Audra Murfield-Langston's paper on Marcel Aimé's La Tête des Autres. When I read the title, I was thinking about, Jacques Duquesne wrote a book about the Catholic Church in which he talks about the period of self-flagellation that follows as France collapses in 1940 as a period of a massive mea culpa sur la poitrine des autres. And then I was kind of wondering if this other sort of notion of, sur la tête des autres, la poitrine des autres was sort of a common theme. Here she moves to a portrayal of life in occupied France, produced in the post-war, and links to the trends that Walls describes as far as the polar, the selfishness, the corruption, the hypocrisy, contrasting the negative reception of his play in 1952 to its most recent reception to its most recent performance last spring. Clearly, France has shifted from an inability to digest the Vichy experience to a culture ready to face it, or at least a caricature of it, if only via the distancing of real time and also of production values that clearly set it back its half century or more. In its first incarnation in 52, the war was still close, although I can't think of 52 as the immediate post-war. It's been 8 years. That's 2 presidential administrations for us. But it was still too close to events. And it's funny to me, of course, that judges and lawyers, the magistracy, were particularly offended by the suggestion that they may not have been so magisterial, but instead could have been corrupt, hypocritical, and linked behind the scenes to shady foreign traffickers, black marketeers, maybe even Gestapo agents. In 52, he was criticized as having gone too far in his sort of critique of the justice system, and not just by the rightish press, like Le Figaro, but more centrist Le Monde and even the Libération. And I think it was particularly galling to people who wrote for the Libération that Aimé, while he may not have penned pro-collaborationist or anti-Semitic screeds in La Gerbe or Je suis partout, had been willing to take a paycheck and contribute to these journals that did print this most vile collaborationist stuff. And I wonder if they might have been more willing to accept this kind of critique if it had been written by somebody who actually had resisted. So it was partly who he was. Secondly, as you point out, the mirror he puts up to reveals the ugly reality of life during this moment when the Gaullist myth was kind of at its height, whereby a small cabal of evil people ran France and profited from the misery while the rest of 40 million Frenchmen secretly resisted and struggled and, sort of didn't do bad stuff. The kind of profiteering and corruption would have been okay if he was only pointing at Vichy and the collaborators, but who was he to point the finger at the rest of us, and particularly judges and lawyers? And we know that under the surface, most judges and lawyers who were judging people after the war were busy judging people during the war based on Vichy law. This is sort of a lot of continuity there. Okay, the 2013 appreciation is about distance from events. It's not us anymore, and they're no longer angry about a figure like Aimé and the choices that he made or didn't make, more willing to accept the premise that not all French people had been angels. I don't know about making Robert into a feminist heroine. I'm going to leave that for others to ask about, but it's clear he was hitting a nerve about the justice system, that he was calling into question its legitimacy, and with his anti-death penalty position in defense of Bazillac, a blatant collaborationist, he's asking really who was blameless, who really had the right to judge. And these are questions, of course, that continue to vex us as historians of the era. And that's all. Thank you very much.